Good morning and welcome to the early warning briefing for Friday, the 14th of February, 2025. Happy Valentine's Day. I am your host, Mark Nielsen. I am joined today by Mike Shelby. Jared and Robert are out. Good morning, Mike. How about we jump right inside the Beltway? Looks like Trump has announced, has been talking for a couple days about these reciprocal tariffs. And we also have the House GOP now mulling over a new continuing resolution before this spending deadline. What's going on? Oh, Mike, I think you're muted.
There we go. I tell you, filling in for Jared here, running everything on the back end. Lots going on. All right. Yeah, Mark, that's right. Lots going on here. House Republicans are considering this continuing resolution. They're up against the 14 March deadline to avert a possible government shutdown. This is over the budget and also the lifting of the debt ceiling. Republicans will need some Democrat support in the Senate. Republicans need 60 votes. They only have 53. And similar situation in the House. Republicans are going to be, I believe, short, so they're going to need some Democrats over there as well. So House Speaker Mike Johnson said that Democrats are making a spending bill. They're making counteroffers that are, quote, not deliverable. And so this is going to force the Republican majority into, I guess, some creative ways to try to make this happen in Congress, Mark.
All right. Thanks, Mike. All right, moving on now. Officials from the Office of Personnel Management met with multiple government agencies this week to advise them in firing their probationary employees. And this has resulted in thousands of federal workers laid off this week alone. So right now, as it stands, approximately 280,000 federal employees of the 2.3 million federal workforce were hired within the last 2 years. So this makes them probationary under federal guidelines and thus easier to fire. So far, about 75,000 government employees have already signed up for Trump's proposed buyout. We've covered that on the show earlier. So that's about 3% of the civilian workforce, but we're seeing additional firings and laying off of federal employees throughout the week. This is kind of a creative solution that we've kind of discussed before on the show, is the Trump administration, as it seeks to kind of cull back this federal workforce. It's starting with the lowest hanging fruit, which are these probationary employees. They don't have the same protections as the rest of the federal workforce. And so it appears that the laying off of federal workers is really accelerating now. And we're seeing already just this week alone, thousands of federal employees laid off. All right. And then finally, Mike, let's jump into these reciprocal tariffs. We were talking a bit about this before the show. What's going on?
Yeah, I just want to point out here briefly that chart over there to the left. You can see that U.S. average tariff rates, this is back in 2017, are far lower than the world average than many other countries. And so President Trump is directing now the U.S. Trade Representative and also the Commerce Secretary to propose new tariffs on a country-by-country basis in order to rebalance trade relations with these foreign trading partners. And let me just take one step back here. And I've talked about mercantilism before. And Michael Every over at Rabobank, I think, was the first person to bring this up, that the United States is going back to a mercantilist system. And just briefly, what happens is when a country is running massive trade deficits, they are giving their money away to another country. And when that country is not reciprocally buying, then you're essentially depleting your treasuries. And this goes back to the colonial era in Europe, where silver was the standard of trade. And so what happens is you have two countries, one with a large trade imbalance, and they would spend their silver to purchase items from country A, would do that with country B. And if country B was not spending that silver to buy back from country A, then country A would be depleting its silver reserves. And then all that extra money would flow to country B, and they could spend that money to build a military, to hire mercenaries. And so it really was a very difficult situation. And this is essentially the same situation that the United States has been in with China, with just these massive trade imbalances. And so this is something that President Trump is now trying to fix. Commerce Secretary nominee Howard Lutnick said that all studies for these reciprocal tariffs will be finished by the 1st of April, and then Trump could act on these tariffs immediately afterward. Also, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the administration is also looking at currency manipulation ahead of the April deadline. And, this is something that we've talked about before is Trump wants a weaker dollar because that makes U.S. goods less expensive abroad, which will boost U.S. exports, which will bring jobs back to America. This is the argument from the Trump administration. I just thought it was interesting because they're talking about currency manipulation, artificially lowering the value of the dollar, which is, we have accused the Chinese of doing exactly this for decades. And so on that topic, just briefly, we know what China's going to do. China's just going to manipulate their currency and devalue their currency to undercut any attempts to make these U.S. goods more competitive abroad. So this is an economic and trade war essentially that's happening. Mark.
Yeah, Mike. And, we did report on this a little while ago. As I understand it, part of this strategy is also there's a lot of money left on the table in some of these countries that we want to fix some of these trade imbalances. Europe is a big example of this. We have the VAT tax. We have digital taxes that we've talked about. There's a lot of money left on the table. And so it seems significant to me that the Trump administration, when it's looking at tariff and non-tariff barriers, it's also looking at things like currency manipulation and the value of the dollar at the same time. And so as they're looking at these other taxes, all this money on the table, and there seems to be a lot more leverage this time around. There also in certain respects, but there also seems to be a difference in strategy. This isn't just going to be a piecemeal, here, a tariff there. It looks like the Trump administration is looking at everything. And so I think this will be very interesting to watch going on. But the real wild card here in all of this is China, as you mentioned. We might have a little more leverage over Europe than we did in the past, but China is always going to be that wild card. All right. Thanks, Mike. Let's jump now down into our roll-up items. Could you take us through those?
Sure. Yeah, we'll start off here with Salt Typhoon. This is this advanced persistent threat from China, a Chinese-backed hacking group. They Recorded Future, which is a U.S. cybersecurity firm, has said that this China-linked hacking group continues its hacking campaign from December 2024 into January 25, and they compromised 2 more U.S.-based telecoms. And this Salt Typhoon also targeted university networks, likely targeting the telecommunications technology research that was being conducted there. So that's continuing. Moving on here to the Arctic. Canada's Arctic territorial premiers held a joint conference yesterday in Washington, D.C. to discuss the security and mineral situation in their territories. All 3 premiers agreed that foreign allied nations should help invest in military infrastructure and develop ports to assist the Canadian Armed Forces. This is another part of trying to militarize the Arctic because we see Russia doing this. We see China doing this. And so the Arctic is becoming much more geostrategically important. Moving on to Taiwan here. Taiwan's president announced this morning that his government is raising the national defense spending to at least 3% of their GDP. And they're going to run a campaign to counter China's what they call as cognitive warfare, and also attempt to increase other democratic nations' dependency on them for high technology. Moving on to India, there was a big press conference yesterday between Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, and President Trump. And the Indians are going to start buying more, working with their American counterparts to increase Indian gas purchases in order to reduce that trade deficit. This goes back to this whole trade thing, trying to get balanced trade deals with many of these countries. India becoming also very geostrategically important. And then over in NORTHCOM, U.S. Northern Command, they are talking about this Iron Dome, and they say essentially that these sensors for an American Iron Dome could be integrated into a single grid within a year. And he said this, Northern Command's commander said this at a Senate hearing yesterday. And then finally here, Mark, I think we're going to turn this back over to you for this carrier collision.
Yeah, Mike. So as it was all over the news, there's a lot of talk on this on social media, a lot of questions too. So the carrier USS Harry S. Truman collided with a merchant ship on Wednesday night. There were no injuries reported, but there was flooding and reactor damage in the ship. So the Navy is still investigating the cause of this incident. But Jared and I were discussing this a little bit before the show, as Jared has a lot of background in the Navy. And so both ships were very close to shore at the time, and the merchant the merchant vessel had just left the Suez. So there's a really good chance that one or both of these ships were under the command of an Egyptian pilot. Ultimately, though, this incident is likely to have just been a mishap, and there's nothing that shows signs of being nefarious or negligent. And so Jared just wanted to put that out there and kind of quell some of the questions. There was a lot of suspicion that this was foul play, but it looks, at least by Jared's read, that at the time, it seems that there is really probably nothing nefarious or negligent. But that said, we will continue to monitor that as we move forward. Okay, and Mike, let's move on now for our warning items. Could you walk us through a couple of those to kick things off?
Certainly. This is coming up tomorrow. It is there's an event on Saturday called Take Down Tesla. There are protests being scheduled at dozens of Tesla dealerships. Activists are protesting against Elon Musk's role in the Trump administration's efforts to cut all these federal budgets and programs. And the bottom line here, you can see the map there. They're going to be pretty widespread. We've seen just generally from these protests, we're talking about dozens to hundreds of people. This is not a mass protest movement. They're not going to be thousands upon thousands or tens of thousands of people showing up at these dealerships. So this is going to be, it looks to be like a picket line type protest. I don't think they're, maybe they may try to occupy a Tesla dealership and do some of the more civil disobedience type style protests. But I tell you, the biggest risk here is that we actually see arson attacks against these Tesla vehicles. This is something that these far left groups have done repeatedly, primarily against law enforcement vehicles, cop cars. In Portland, one group out there was able to cut through a fence, and they ended up damaging, like, I think it was 15 or 17 cop cars that was in a parking lot at the police station, and they lit like one car on fire, and then it exploded and caught the other cars on fire. So, this is something I would be concerned about if I was running Tesla security.
Absolutely. All right, moving on now. So we talked a little bit about Northcom already, and we talked a little bit about the Iron Dome sensors and some of the plans that the Trump administration has for that. But there was a really interesting Senate hearing yesterday in which the drone threat was openly discussed, and then some countermeasures were proposed. So during a Senate Armed Services hearing yesterday, U.S. North Command, Northcom Commander General Gregory Gilloy said that over 350 unauthorized drone incursions were detected over 100 U.S. military installations, and more than 1,000 unauthorized drones were detected along the southern border alone in 2024. Now, Gilloy said that the drones pose an increasing threat to homeland security and military readiness due to foreign adversary surveillance of U.S. military facilities and the vulnerability of U.S. facilities and critical infrastructure to drone-borne improvised explosive attacks. Now, why does all this matter? So defense officials are warning that these counter-drone authorities and non-nuclear facilities are lacking. The United States has kind of been behind the curve on this. Mike, we talked about this several times about how domestic drone production here in the United States has kind of been stifled. That there hasn't really been a lot of movement. There hasn't been a lot of promotion of the civilian market. And this has actually kind of caused the market growth here in the United States to kind of stagnate. And this has kind of put us all behind the curve. So in other words, the United States seems to be, especially under the Trump administration, seems to be taking this very seriously now, and especially the military. One thing I'll add just on perspective-wise is I've been paying really close attention to electronic warfare and its development in the U.S. military. Typically, the Navy tends to have a lot more strength in this area, even though the Army is the branch that inaugurated it. But I have seen, we've been watching over even just the last 6 months, there has been a major transformation in how the U.S. military is handling electronic warfare. And I think the lead here is it is because of this drone technology. And so not only does the United States need to amp up its domestic drone research and development, but it also needs to work on these counter drone measures. And so it appears, Mike, that the U.S. military is taking this very seriously and trying to kind of make up a lot of lost ground in countering some of these drone technologies.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine that most of these drones are probably hobbyists, but there is the very real national security problem of terrorist use of drones. I go back to Sarah Adams, and she was on the Sean Ryan show, and she's been on there several times, but she's been talking about Al Qaeda worldwide and how they want to launch terror attacks here in the United States. And it sounds like they're trying to do these swarm attacks, like the Mumbai style attacks. But I tell you, these armed drones it is not difficult to build these, and it obviously could cause a lot of problems. I'm actually not sure. I think the counter drone technology is really lacking, and by far that seems to be the biggest problem for us from a national security perspective. Well, counter drone technology, but also just being able to identify these things.
Yeah, and Mike, one other thing to add there that I do think is some leverage maybe that the U.S. government will have is it does have full spectrum dominance when it comes to the electromagnetic spectrum in the United States, highly regulated, right? And so this is going to be an opportunity for the government to have to really make up for years and years of leaving this kind of on the table. There's a lot of, even though the electromagnetic spectrum appears to be saturated, there's still a lot of area, or I guess room for the U.S. government to be able to kind of partition out sections of the spectrum and to focus in on drone technologies being able to be used here so that it can be more regulated and monitored. But yeah, it seems that in drone technology, we're behind the curve, but we're really behind when it comes to this counter drone technology. As I understand it, we're already seeing geopolitically, we're seeing, leaders like Israel are already moving into other parts of Latin America. So the Western Hemisphere already has a lot of these drone technology options from either the Chinese or the Israelis, but the U.S. is just not there. So we'll definitely have to see how this moves forward. But as I understand it from those that are on the inside, the U.S. military is taking this very seriously.
Well, they should, because that's a massive problem.
Yeah. All right, Mike, how about you take us through the rest of our roll-up items, and I'll probably I'll end with this piece on the Russian naval base in Sudan.
Okay, sure. Grid stability has been, Robert's been beating that drum for years here. And the problem of grid instability, just to take us back a few years here, there's this thing called Clean Power Plan 2.0. And this was Clean Power Plan 1.0 was first introduced under Obama, and it failed. And Biden said, well, let's bring this back for 2.0. And what it was is trying to phase out all these fossil fuel fired power plants and replacing them with these green energy, renewable energy power plants. Well, it's not even a power plant, it's wind and solar. And so the problem is reliability is diminished because it takes about 5 watts of green energy to equal the reliability of 1 watt of fossil fuel powered energy. So the problem is we've been going backwards. So that's for the first part of the problem. Power demand is increasing. Power supply is not increasing commensurate with the demand. And so that's one reason why we've seen these shortages. This is one reason why these AI data centers have been delayed. The construction has been delayed by, in some cases, up to 2 years, because there's just not enough power production in some of these regions. And then we also have the problem of as the country grows and they're building these new homes, new residential areas, new industrial areas, farther and farther away. Now you have the problem of electricity transmission. And so one of the things they've been trying to do is do reconductoring, and they go back through and there's like a carbon fiber aluminum power line that they try to reconductor all these lines, and that's supposed to solve some of these problems. So it's my point is it's not just a power production problem, it is also a power transmission problem. And now it's going to be a transformer problem here, because according to the recent National Renewable Energy Laboratory study, U.S. electrical grids have a 60 to 80 million disruption U.S. electrical grids currently have 60 to 80 million distribution transformers, and the need for these new transformers on U.S. grids could grow up to 260% by the year 2050. And says one of these researchers, quote, "We're approaching a time of unprecedented demand for transformers," and this is amid growing power demand, and that is straining power infrastructure. And some of this infrastructure is also approaching the end of its life cycle. So during earnings calls this week, some utilities said that they're increasing spending plans for new power generation in order to shore up the grid here. There's this there's a special type of steel that's used in these transformers. It's called grain-oriented electrical steel. It's a special type of steel that's used for electrical infrastructure, and there's currently a shortage of that steel. There's two places in the United States And I think one of them was kind of like teetering, maybe going out of business. So we may just be down to one production facility for this steel. And then they're also having not only high prices, but they're having supply chain disruptions for aluminum and copper. And then so that's increasing their production time. And that's going to be made worse probably by these impending tariffs if they all go through as planned. And we're looking at these lead times, which are already 2 to 3 years away for these new specialty transformers. So there has been some movement on expanding production. There's been 2 plants, like I mentioned before. And then apparently I think there are plans to open new production facilities for that specialty steel. And they're going to start production in 2026 and 2027. So Mark, we're really still kind of under the gun here on grid reliability and stability. And it's a very complex problem to solve. It's going to take a long time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. All right, to end with our warning items for the day, we'll move over to our global section here. So Sudan's foreign minister announced yesterday that Russia will build a naval base on Sudan's Red Sea coast. Now, previous attempts by Russia to establish a base in Sudan fell through in 2017 and 2020 due to civil war and coup. Right now, there is a lot of inner conflict going on in Sudan. And so right now, we don't really know exactly whether this base will be established, but the plans to do so are now in place. Now, historically, Sudan has been too unstable to be able to do much for Russia in terms of allowing much permanent infrastructure there. But if Sudan and Russia build this base, this will be a permanent Russian naval presence on the Red Sea, and it would give them an alternative to the Syrian naval base that they just lost. And it would also give them partial control over Red Sea traffic. So this is a significant geopolitical position. Now, why does this matter to the average American? Something to just keep in mind is what we saw happen over in Syria is Russia's sphere of influence was significantly diminished after the Assad regime was toppled, but this does have rippling effects that reach out to the United States. So as we've already seen in Sudan, Russia's trying to establish a naval presence there, gives it some partial control over the Red Sea, very important place. But Russia has also moved over to Libya, and it's trying to establish another naval base there. Now, why does this matter? Is these locations kind of serve as crossroads for the Middle East and into sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things that has been a major frustration for the United States in recent years is the United States is slowly being pushed out of parts of Africa, which it wishes to maintain a presence. Not only because of some of the strategic interests that we might have there in terms of minerals and power and things like that, energy, but also because of the growing threat of terrorism. So as you've watched in Syria, as the government changes hands, and as we see some of these terrorist groups spread out to other parts of Africa, they do have an ability to eventually project into places like the United States. And so the United States has tried to maintain kind of a bit of a handle on parts of Africa that could potentially destabilize Europe and the United States. With Russia occupying some of these key geopolitical positions on the African continent, they're able to essentially control the access to these different regions. And that could always come back in the form of terrorism being exported to the United States, into Europe, migrant crises taking place in both locations. And so this kind of is one of those things that we might not hear much about it now, here and there, but in the long term, if Russia is able to really maintain a geopolitical position in these places, it could turn out to be very difficult for the United States and its European allies. All right, well, that does it for today's warning items and for today's report. Mike, thanks for filling in for Robert and Jared. It was great to be able to go through these with you. I did want to just mention that typically we have a roundtable on Fridays. Our roundtable today will be postponed, rolled on till later, just given the fact that our 2 analysts are out today. But we do appreciate all the great questions that we had coming in. What we'll try to do is we'll try to save some of these that have a slow burn that we can address later, and we'll try to hit those on the next time we do our roundtable. But as always, today's report will be in your inbox, so please check for it there. And then we'll be back with you next week at 08 Central Time. Mike, do you have anything to add just before we turn off?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to answer this one question here. A different Mike asked, does a weaker dollar mean that stuff at home in the U.S. costs more? And a weaker dollar means our imports will cost more. So as the dollar weakens against other currencies, if it's weakening against another currency, then yes, imports will cost more. But this is part of the whole Trump plan. When foreign imports cost more, he wants it to be economical for that stuff to be made in the United States. So this will be a rocky process. But even before Trump took office, we we're just looking at inflation data. It was already ticking up prior to Trump taking office. I think there's still some debate on whether these tariffs will be inflationary or not, because the argument is as products become more expensive, consumers will find alternatives or they'll be buying less of it. And so that decreased demand, I mean, we look at supply demand. So, I think with that decreased demand, they say that will not be inflationary. It will kind of even itself out. I'm not an economist, but at least that's their argument. It kind of makes sense to me. But inflation is ticking up. It will be a problem. And I'll tell you, just looking at the left, and sorry, Mark, this is my last thing here. The left is trying to gain traction. And my concern is that higher inflation is going to create economic hardships for the United States. And if we do get into another inflationary spike, like we had in midway through 2021 into 22, like we had back during the Great Inflation, which was from the mid 1960s all the way up to 1982. If it does get that bad again, I think the risk of protests increases dramatically. And so economic hardship at home, especially if it can be pinned or there's a perception that the Trump administration can be blamed for it, that I think that's going to give them some traction. So that's why all this weaker dollar stuff and currency manipulation stuff matters. Trump is trying to fix a long-term problem that should have been fixed decades ago. And something that took decades to fix is not going to take months to fix. It's going to be rocky. It may even be a little bit painful, but it's something that there's no alternative. I mean, what is the alternative? The alternative is that we just keep exporting our jobs abroad and we spend ourselves into collapse. I mean, that is the only alternative. So we pretty much got to fix it now, Mark.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. We've talked so much about whether deportations will be the galvanizing force, whether these federal cuts of these jobs will be a galvanizing force for Trump's resistance, which we've talked a lot about. But if this economic picture doesn't improve for regular people, that will be the alternative. And that has the most weight. That's probably the most muscular issue that you could rally an opposition around. That's a great point. All right. Well, hey, Mike, thanks so much for filling in for these guys. I did want to just do a shout out. Anybody who is joining the program today, maybe for the first time, or you've been following Early Warning Network and tuning in for the morning briefings, I do want to make sure that if you're not a member, you can become a member of Early Warning Network with our Early Warning Network free trial. It's a 7-day trial. You can go to earlywarningnetwork.com to access that free trial. What that will give you is you can go on the high side that we have, and we have additional reporting. If you liked what we're talking about with the Trump resistance, that's something we're really focusing on and trying to analyze and craft out and understand for years to come here. But we will be providing additional content there that you'll have access to. You'll be able to be part of our community, share intel, insights, and tips. And then we'll be also able to give you additional resources and materials that we have in our library and access to our watch floor. So there's a lot of benefit to joining Early Warning Network. So if this might be your first time coming in, go and check out earlywarningnetwork.com and tap into that free 7-day trial. All right. Thanks, Mike. I hope you all have a great weekend. And as always, stay out front.